Okay. Good evening to everyone. It is both an honor and a solemn responsibility to welcome you to today's lecture here at our premises of the Institute of International Economic Relations, which addresses one of the most complex, enduring, and deeply consequential conflicts in our time, the war in Gaza and the broader Palestine-Israeli conflict. This is a topic that has shaped the modern history of the Middle East, influenced global geopolitics, and evoked profound humanitarian concerns. It is a subject that demands not only intellectual rigor, but also empathy, and a commitment to understanding the multi-faced dimension of a struggle that has persisted for generations. Today, we are privileged to have with us a distinguished guest whose expertise, insight, and first-hand experience make them uniquely qualified to speak on this critical issue. From war to peace, the international relations implication of the Israel-Hamas war. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Arie Kacowicz, a renowned scholar whose work has illuminated the political, historical, and human dimension of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Professor Kacowicz is a professor of international relations and the Weizmann Chair of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a faculty member of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem since 1993, and was the president of the Israeli Association of International Studies during the period 2017-2021. A very prestigious institutions, and I think every year has its annual conference, if I remember well.
Yes.
He has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University since 2002, and he's going also to Washington next summer to teach in a summer school at Georgetown University. He is the author and editor of 10 books, mostly dealing with peace in international relations. His current research projects include the study of the relevance of the international society after the decline of the liberal international order. Some perhaps they say after the disappearance of the liberal international order. The development of a matrix to understand and explain the global governance in international politics, and exploring alternative paths to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a focus upon the Confederation blueprint, which will be the focus of your lecture today. His career has been defined by a commitment to bridging divides, fostering dialogue, and seeking solutions to one of the world's most intractable conflicts. His perspective is informed not only by his scholarly expertise, but also by his unwavering commitment to justice and the belief that even the most entrenched conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and political will. When I was coming here, I was thinking that we are talking about a conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian, which has started in 1948 and perhaps for some previously, and it is only for a small piece of land. The same is happening with Cyprus, which also started in the 1950s. The same applies to Kashmir, and the same applies also to Taiwan, which are for a small land. But the narratives, I think, play the most important role. It is not the land as such, as your compatriot has one of your compatriots has pointed out. Today, Professor Kacowicz will address the ongoing war in Gaza, a crisis that has captured global attention and sparked intense debate. As we listen to lecture, I encourage all of us to approach this discussion with an open mind and a willingness to engage with perspectives that may differ from our own. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a deeply polarizing issue, and it is easy to retreat into familiar narratives. But true understanding requires us to move beyond simplistic binaries and confront the complexities of history, identity, and power that underpin this conflict. It requires us to recognize the humanity of all those affected and to seek solutions that uphold the principles of justice, dignity, and coexistence. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kacowicz, whose insights today will undoubtedly deepen our understanding of this critical issue and inspire us to think critically about the role we can play in building a better future for the area. Thank you, Professor, and welcome.
Thank you very much. I guess I will stand up. I mean, I'm small anyway. So it's really an honor to be here. I'm here actually on vacation for a week with my wife in Athens, but I think that it's a very good opportunity. I think the last time I was serious in this city was 42 years ago, and I'm learning. And I'm aware how many words we know from Greek. You mentioned the term empathy, which is something that we are missing and back at home. And there are so many parallels, but that's another lecture, Athens and Jerusalem, all civilizations. So first I want to thank you, Professor Tarnantins, and Stella and Effie for bringing me here. You know, those are very difficult times. If I would be back at home in Jerusalem, I would be in the streets. Many of us at the university might be, or they are demonstrating right now against the government. And in a sense, that changed a bit of the sequence of the lecture in the sense that I was among those who believed that the fragile ceasefire on January 19, maybe that was the end of the war. But that's something that we could know only with the benefit of hindsight. Unfortunately, 2 days ago, I mean, or actually yesterday, March 18, we are seeing a return to the war. And in a sense, this has to do with the domestic politics. This has been a very lethal attack early yesterday. And right now, there are other military actions have been taken. So the ceasefire has been shattered. That does not mean that this fire might not return. We know from other conflicts that ceasefires are fragile and a truce, so we still don't have a perspective. And one thing that I always like to emphasize, and you know, I define myself not just a professor of IIER, but as a peace scholar. And I'm among those who want to emphasize the term peace. You know, back at home, in Israel, peace has been degraded. People talk about normalization. So what I will try to do, I will try to walk you for the next half hour. I know that's what lecturers we say, that we can keep talking all the time. But for me, it would be more interesting to try to engage in a dialogue. So in a sense, in the lecture or in this part, in the monologue, I think that's another Greek term, the first part, I'm going to refer to the international relations implications of the Israel-Hamas war. And in the second part of the talk, I want to speculate more about possible scenarios. And that's, there is a paper that I circulate to you, that it's a draft paper that has to do with this model of peaceful territorial change that I developed in the 90s, and only now I'm writing about the case of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. By the way, listening to your initial remarks, I wish we would be in the Cyprus case, because you might say the Cyprus case has not been resolved since the war and the partition, but nobody has been killed. You know, so this is a kind of conflict that has been frozen. I wish we might even be in the direction of Kashmir, that now India and Pakistan might have some type of relations. And I think Taiwan and China is also a different story. The problem with the Israel-Palestinian conflict, that it's neither an international conflict, because You have Israel, you have the state of Palestine, but it's not a real state. So it reminds us more of former Yugoslavia, kind of ethno-national conflict, but it's neither a complete civil war. But you might say, and I'm in a sense deviating from the talk, but just to give a sense for those of you that might be confused, at least in my assessment, the Israel-Palestinian conflict is a fight between two peoples that, in my definition, both are indigenous people to the land and they're claiming the same piece of land, what we say land of Israel or Palestine. And you are right that it started officially with the Declaration of Israel in 1948, but actually you can go back in time to the Jewish-Arab conflict back to the late part of the 19th century, when you start returning politically under Zionism, and then you have the emergence of the Arab nationalism and later on Palestinian nationalism. Okay, but I'll try to get back to that. I know I'm trying to put many things together, but let's try to do this in a more organized way. If you would be my students, I would have more time, we can talk about trying to define peace. Okay? For the sake of the argument, we can take a minimalist version of peace. Peace in the sense of absence of war, negative peace. Because peace can go all the way in terms of gradation to Galtung or beyond Baldung, for those of you who are familiar with that, to harmony, the Yellow Submarine, John Lennon, the harmony, the absence of conflict. By the way, as professors, we tend to be very pedant in the sense that you have to be very strict in terms. Even if the war might stop tomorrow, and let's pray about that, that does not mean that the conflict would go away. Because many times people confuse between conflict and war. But when we talk about peace, and I will talk today about peace, let's say that if we get a negative peace and absence of war, that might be more than enough at this stage. Then later on, we might talk about stable peace, where war is no longer a possibility, all the way to positive peace. So in this talk, the first part, as I mentioned, I want to refer to the implications and consequences of the Israel-Hamas war that started, as you know, on October 7, 2023, with this massacre perpetrated by Hamas against mostly civilians, sovereign Israeli territory. This did not happen in occupied or disputed territory. And just to give you a sense, you were talking about empathy. Since I'm not just a scholar, an objective one, but I'm also an Israeli citizen, the Israeli people were traumatized. And I can tell you stories, I don't have time. I even have a nephew, my wife's sister's daughter, that she ran for her life for 4 hours, and she survived that party. Okay? Not to talk about the trauma, because the Israeli military reaction led to the almost physical destruction of the Gaza Strip. So the Palestinians are traumatized as well. So there are implications, there are consequences. Implications might be more general, consequences might be direct, or there might be unintended consequences, which is very interesting. If you want to take one point from the talk, you might say that probably the most important implication and consequence of this war is the return of the Palestinian issue to the center stage. Before October 2023, there was no much of an emphasis upon the Palestinian issue. Looking from the Israeli perspective, years before, there was maybe an illusion that you can manage the conflict. You don't have to resolve it. You can make peace with Arab countries. That happened under Trump. If you remember, we are all having amnesia. That's another Greek term, I assume, right? 4 years or 5 years ago, you have the Abraham Accords, and that bypassed the Palestinian issue. So the return of the Palestinian issue, I would say that's probably the most important implication. You cannot ignore that anymore. The question is how we are going to resolve it. for those here colleagues that we deal with international relations, we can talk about levels of analysis. So I would refer briefly about the implications of the war regarding the bilateral relations of Israel with other actors. I would briefly, I'm trying to be ambitious here, the regional context, which I think it's very important, and I'm giving you a second, important point. If there is a rate of hope, it might come from the regional context. And the systemic one. And on the systemic one, looking at the geopolitics, as you were referring, and I assume that's another Greek term, yes. You might say that here I want to be a bit provocative, because many people say, yes, this war has changed global politics. And I think that you were asking me whether I'm Francophone. You don't have to be Francophone to assume this slogan, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, in the sense that there is a lot of continuity. As I mentioned, in the second half of the brief talk, I want to refer to scenarios, peace and the day after, the possibility of peaceful change. And as I already mentioned, a huge obstacle to apply models that we develop in international relations is the fact that the Israel-Palestinian conflict, it's a kind of hybrid conflict. It's neither a civil war like Sudan, or like Congo that we watch now on TV, the return to the war in Congo, but it's neither a clear case of an international conflict. Because otherwise it would be much easier to resolve, like with Egypt, like with Jordan, okay? So I would refer to, that's my favorite part, if you want, to the model of peaceful territorial change. Historically, there was an initial attempt under the Oslo process in the 90s that failed. And the question, although back at home, people think that I'm dreaming, whether the model might be relevant after the war. One thing, and again, you see, this is an academic lecture, but I'm also bringing my personal belief. It's very difficult to disengage that. I can tell you, since the war, I have been writing like 40 blogs, Hebrew, English, Spanish, because if you give up, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And people were telling me there were 40,000 people. You told me, or somebody else told me, 40,000 people in Tel Aviv. That's a huge demonstration. I wish there would be 500,000. But people are exhausted. But if you give up about thinking about ideas outside of the box, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. So let's do the formal part, if you want the academic part. Israel foreign policy and the bilateral relations. Let's look at the bilateral relations here. You could make the case that the war, and as time has passed on, and now that there seems to be a renewal of the war, which is a catastrophe. I mean, you could say, well, a year ago there was a legitimacy, or a year and a half, a self-defense. Now there is no strategic or logical sense. It's just domestic politics. But you could say that the war, as time, as time evolved, that posed a serious blow to the legitimacy and diplomacy of the Israeli side. That's quite obvious. Where do you see that? You see that in cases, and you have that here in the outlines. Not many countries, but there were a few that broke diplomatic relations, Colombia and Bolivia and Latin America. Most of the countries returned ambassadors from the region: Jordan, Bahrain, Turkey. It's interesting, Erdogan was saying, you don't broke relations, but he returned ambassador, Honduras, Chile, Belize, Brazil, in the Americas, South Africa, and Chad as well. So you might say Israel has not become a pariah state, but there are very serious consequences and implications. We see that on the legal realm, with the ICJ and especially with the ICC issuing warrants against the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former defense minister. And that carries implications in the sense that that might carry, sanctions. And it's like you might say, a domino effect there. That's very serious. There is another dimension. You can see that, but again, it's not so dramatic. Before the war, you have 139 countries that recognize a Palestinian state. Now you have 146. So that added Armenia, Slovenia, Bahamas, Ireland, Norway, Jamaica, and Spain. Now, in my assessment, and I know it's very different from many Israeli analysts, I don't see that necessarily as a zero sum. I mean, the recognition of a Palestinian state does not mean necessarily coming against Israel. The question is which Palestinian state, whether it's a Palestinian state alongside Israel or instead of Israel. So I differentiate between the slogan Free Palestine from the river to the sea from the call for a creation of the militarized Palestinian state. The other dimension has to do with the relations between Israel and different actors in the international system. Regarding the US, what has become evident under Biden, former President Biden, and under this President Trump, that we have to live with Trump for the next almost 4 years, is that you see the complete dependence of Israel upon the United States. And this came to the point that right now, many of us in Israel, the hope has to do with Trump. I mean, our hope, or Witkoff seems to be somebody with empathy, even more than many people in the Israeli government. But it's clear that you have a complete dependence. I mean, Israel has always been dependent militarily, diplomatically upon the US. Now it's even more than that. With Europe, I know you are part of Europe, and I think the relations between Israel and Greece, they're fine. There might be shared interests, might be shared without getting into that discussion. Countries that maybe our two countries don't particularly like. But you might say with Europe, it's very interesting that you see also the change over time, the dynamics of the process. At the beginning of the war, you saw most of the Western European leaders coming to Israel, identifying with Israel after the massacre. And as time went on, you see an erosion. Still, the relations between Israel and Europe are crucial. What is interesting, just to say a word, because I'm giving you a short review of many things. Russia and China, it's interesting that before the war, I can tell you since the last few years I'm teaching Israel foreign policy, Israel before the war adopted this approach that now it's very famous with Trump, which is called transactionalist, if you know the term. In the sense, trying to play in between, like a kind of non-alignment. And the Prime Minister Netanyahu that ran for many elections, he belongs to a different league. So you could see pictures of him with Putin and with the Chinese leader. What is interesting is that, as I mentioned, before the war, Israel tried to keep equidistant between Russia and Ukraine after the invasion of Ukraine, or even China and Taiwan regarding China. And what is clear that both Russia and China, they adopted a much more hostile positions towards Israel compared to Europe and compared to the Western democratic countries. And I think the most interesting case, and I will stop, hopefully I will stop by 7 to allow for a Q&A so I can tell a bit more about those different actors. I'm originally from Latin America. Maybe you can hear my Spanish behind my English. So I moved to Israel out of option 45 years ago. So the Global South case, it's a fascinating one because it's very hard to generalize about the Global South. Many Global South countries, they complain about the hypocrisy or double standards comparing the war in Gaza with the war between Russia and Ukraine. But when you look carefully at the different regions, Latin America, Africa, India, the Middle East, you see that there is a lot of heterogeneity, another Greek term, right? I mean, in the sense that you don't have a uniform position. In Latin America, it goes all the way from countries like my native country, Argentina, and that has to do with the fact that there have been many hostages from the kibbutzim that they came from Argentina that supported Israel, all the way to Colombia, Chile, Brazil, a very unclear position. The same for Africa, and even, I'm telling you something that it might surprise you when you read now the Arab League recent meeting, week ago or so, or even the meeting they had a few months ago, when you read their common declaration of the Arab League, which is the, you might say, the less common denominator, they are pretty much moderate. They are not necessarily Zionists, they don't have to be, but in the sense they are in favor of a two-state solution, they are in favor of ending the war, I mean, and in a sense getting to a peaceful solution. And in a sense, what is interesting, you could say that the position of the countries in the Middle East, led by Saudi Arabia, of course, Egypt and Jordan, the UAE, in a sense, it's also very heterogeneous, right? It's not that you have a common position there. Okay. So that takes me, as I mentioned, and I already mentioned, the regional context, the relevance of the Palestinian issue. One very important point to mention is that if you remember that, because, you know, this is only what, 1 year and a half ago, before the war, on the eve of the war in September 2023, there were talks about the possible normalization process with Saudi Arabia. And what is quite interesting is that there is still a talk about that, but today Saudi Arabia insists on two very basic conditions. One is to end the war. The other is to have a clear path towards a Palestinian state. Before the war, maybe it was a lip service. Now, Saudi Arabia, maybe for public opinion reasons, maybe because of the changing realities of the war, has a much more clear position about that. There has been an involvement of the Arab League. The Arab League has not been very efficient, but if you want to look, as I mentioned, to a ray of hope, you can go back and read the initial Egyptian plan that became a plan of the Arab League. It's far from being perfect. For instance, it does not mention Hamas, but you see the involvement of the Arab League. And the involvement of the Arab League, in a sense, you have a pattern that goes back 22 years in history to the Arab Peace Initiative. The Arab Peace Initiative of March 2002, again, I'm not saying that was perfect, but this was an offer from the Arab League, again, led by Saudi Arabia, to make peace with Israel under certain conditions. The regional context, as I mentioned, this is a talk about the implications of the war. You have also kind of unintended consequences. What we have seen in the last year and a half, and it has not ended, you see an active conflict with Iran that led to actually not an open war, but actually 2 attacks in April and October 2024. Essentially, in April, what was also amazing is that the very effective defense orchestrated by the US had the active assistance of a country like Jordan, that today the king of Jordan and the Israeli prime minister, you know, they are not in very good relations at all. And you might even have other countries in the region that participate in intelligence efforts. And something similar you had in October 2024. And in the Middle East, you have as well unintended consequences. I mean, a day after the war started, Hezbollah joined the war, but in a very hesitant way. And in a sense, this continued until November, I think it was November 27, that you have a ceasefire. The ceasefire is more or less in place, and there are even, I think, some good or positive implications, like the election of a president in Lebanon, the deployment of the Lebanese army, and even the beginning of some talks regarding the setting of a territorial dispute. And in Syria, and it's funny, you know, back at home, Israelis brag, we brought about the revolution in Syria. Come on. But what was interesting is that the fall or the weakening of Hezbollah led to the rebels in Syria overthrowing, after 50 years, that's the Assad regime, right? Like a house of cards. So, and that's also quite amazing. Now, I have my own criticism to the fact that Israel right now is occupying areas beyond the Golan Heights, the neutral zone that was under the UN control, and that we don't know what's going to happen. But those are all ripple effects from the war. Moving very quickly, since I'm looking at the time, and regarding international systemic context, I want to say a couple of things, and then I want to leave a few minutes to talk about the second part. So there are some analysts that would say that the war in Gaza is part of three interrelated conflicts, wars, and crises: Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, and China, Taiwan. That might be the case because everything is related to everything else. And you could make the argument that there is some degree of geopolitical competition among the great powers. Now, I am among those who might be a bit more hesitant or skeptic, in the sense that I'm not arguing that this war is going to change international politics. It's clear that the US has a role to play. And, you know, we always tease the US, I never say Americans. You know, the US appropriate the entire continent. Shame on them. But you could say the US has always tried to run from the Middle East, and the Middle East is chasing the US back. And it's interesting because, you know, from Obama to Trump to Biden back to Obama, they don't want to deal. I mean, they want to deal with the Middle East. Trump wants to make money with Saudi Arabia. And Trump wants to get the Nobel Peace Prize. By the way, those are very two positive indicators about what might happen. Russia got, I think, a serious blow from the disappearance of the Assad regime. And China, it's always an interrogation mark, because China cares about China, but China doesn't seem to be very involved. When we look at the next sentence, and this is what you were referring to, is that you could say the war in Gaza, in a sense, affected or has been affected with the rules of the international order. And there is this quest and contention, and we could have an argument. There might be a question coming from the audience whether, you know, Israel has committed genocide in the Gaza Strip or not. My position, or at least the way I read that, Israel has led to a physical destruction almost of the Gaza Strip. It's not necessarily a case of genocide. I don't know what's going to happen, of course, in the next few months, but in a sense that has affected the rule. I mean, those among us who believe in international law, what's called in English called international society, it's very, very difficult. When you look at the role of the UN has been pretty much ineffective. I'm among those. I'm saying right now we should have Chapter 7 to end the renewal of the war, but Chapter 7, you need the 5 permanent powers in the UN to do that, right? Now, one point, the only point I want to emphasize before moving to the second part, which will not be as long as this first part, is that one thing that when you look at the international systemic context, as I mentioned, it's very confusing. The Global South does not have an homogeneous position. And another thing that you can look as another implication of the war, when you look at the demonstrations in the university campuses, when you look at the rage and sometimes ignorance, and I think that there are 2 points that I would emphasize. One is that you could see, as I wrote here, a gap between the international society of states and the global civil society. In other words, countries, maybe at the beginning, they identify more with Israel, right, in the sense that there was a violation of the sovereignty, etc. But at the level of the civil society, there is a clash there. And that clash is within the North and within the South. So again, the reality is very, very complicated. So that brings me very quickly to the second part, and I'll try to no more than 10 minutes because don't be so generous, because the idea here is to have more of a dialogue. There are 2 points I want to mention here. And again, I'm mixing here, I'm bringing you some theoretical concepts. You know, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the theory developed by one of the most important professors of conflict management and resolution at the US, William Zartman. He developed that in the context of Africa. You could apply that in many cases, which is the theory of ripeness. Now, the theory of ripeness is something very tragic, because the idea is that there might be moments in history when two sides in a conflict, they get to what is called a mutually hurting stalemate. You can look at that in a positive sense and think about mutually enticing opportunity. But if we take the tragic way, it means that the two parties get to a position where the continuation of the conflict is inflicting mutual suffering. And that might open up opportunities for a political process. If you want to find an example from the Middle East, that's the case of the war of 1973. The Yom Kippur War was started by Sadat, who was a genius, probably learned Clausewitz, and like my government, where you wage war as a continuation of politics by other means. And you should know that the Yom Kippur War is one of the wars that both parties could declare victory. It was a military victory for Israel after 3 weeks, with almost 3,000 soldiers killed in action. So that led to a ripeness moment, leading to a political process. Would you believe that only 5 years after the war you would have the Camp David agreements, and half a year later you would have a peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt in March 1979, March 26, which is still holding today, okay? Now you could make the argument that after this war, my talk is from war to peace, Israelis and Palestinians might be facing a similar moment of ripeness. Maybe. We can argue about that. You could say, you know, the second intifada lasted for about 5 years. You have 1,000 Israelis killed. You have almost 5,000 Palestinians killed. Did not lead necessarily it did not lead necessarily to a peace process, whereas the first intifada, which was less lethal, led to the Oslo process. And there is a lot of confusion, because usually people tell me, well, when you look at the public opinion on both sides, it went to the right, but it's more complicated than that. So in that sense, you might say we are sitting at the crossroads. And the two options, unfortunately, the first option, that seems to be the reality for the last 48 hours, a return to war, when I was thinking about this lecture. The second option has to do with peaceful change. Now, peaceful change it's a process. I mean, it can be a systemic one or a domestic one, like in South Africa. But in terms of peaceful territorial change is when you have parties, essentially countries. It's easier when it's countries turning territories one to the other. It can be very banal. You know, now Trump wants to get back the Panama Canal or buy Greenland. But, you know, at some time in history, the US was very smart. They bought Alaska from the Russians. They bought Louisiana from the French, Florida from the Spanish. But peaceful territorial changes have happened in history. And the argument I make, I mean, this is the model, is that you have several conditions. Peaceful territorial change would work when the status quo party, I mean, the stronger party, is the status quo one, so it can be more generous. When the parties have similar political regimes, either they are democracies or they are no democracies. A very important point in terms of international relations or international law, to have peaceful change is usually when you have a normative consensus. In other words, there is an agreement regarding sovereignty, because in most cases, and you mentioned Kashmir, for instance, I could add, you know, that crazy war that involved my native country, Argentina, and the UK, Falkland Malvinas. One party wants sovereignty, the other party wants self-determination. So you have a clash between sovereignty and self-determination. Things are easier when there is no such clash. Israel never claimed, for instance, the Sinai Peninsula that got in 1967. Israel always recognized that was Egyptian territory. That's not the case with the West Bank, that at home is called Judea and Samaria. The current government wants to pass a law forbidding the use of the West Bank. Okay? A third point, which is very obvious, peaceful territorial change might happen when you have diplomatic intervention by third parties, mediation. Now, a fifth point might remind us of ripeness. It's a bit tragic. I go all the way back to Kant. You know, Kant was not naive, Immanuel Kant. People think Kant was naive, but Kant was very smart, that you learn the hard way. So another possible condition to bring about peaceful change has to do with experience in previous wars. Because Kant used to say, people are not angels, they learn the hard way. And a last point might have to do with realpolitik, because many things are about realpolitik, third-party threats. If you have a major threat, what brought Israel and some other countries together, maybe the Iranian threat, okay? And this has to do with bargaining, cooperation, and different interests. So, again, I'm running out of time, and you know we can continue the Q&A. As I mentioned, that's a different and very long, complicated conflict regarding the background of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. As I mentioned, it has not started in 1948, goes a long way back. I'm among those that I don't agree with this model of settler colonialism. I think it's much more complicated than that. It's clear that after 1967, when Israel got control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which is controlling the fate of the Palestinian people, that changed the conflict. There was an initial attempt in the 90s. By the way, you know, when I have arguments at home, and I have lots of arguments, and people say, you know, the Oslo process was tried. Well, actually, the Oslo process was never tried because it was very ambiguous. They never talk about a Palestinian state. And the Oslo process was literally killed by the extremists on both sides. So then what you have the last 20 years were also very confusing. One thing was clear. In 2006, you have a cleavage between the two parts of the Palestinian territories, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I mean, the Gaza Strip came under the control of Hamas. And Hamas, in a nutshell, has a very extreme fundamentalist ideology. And in the last 15 years or so, and this is very tragic, and this might be one of the reasons that the government in Israel does not want to establish a state inquiry committee, going back in history to understand what happened, is that in the last 15 years, not just there was a predilection for managing the conflict without resolving, but even preferring having Hamas in the Gaza Strip, not to negotiate with a more moderate Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So, you know, that was the first attempt. And the question, and I'm almost done, whether a model, a similar model can be put in practice after the war, because wars end. I mean, we have seen a return to the war in the last 48 hours. It does not mean that the war will continue for a long time. I can tell you at home, and I know that from, you know, I have hundreds of students, and many of them, they serve in the reserve. There is no appetite. 70% of the Israeli public opinion, they want an end to the war, they want the return of the hostages. The problem is that in strategic terms, to think who's going to replace Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, when you look at the 6 conditions, and I think that's almost the last slide, you may say, well, the distribution of power is in favor of Israel. I mean, you have a obvious asymmetry, different political regimes. In a sense, there is a problem regarding the leaders among all parties. There is not necessarily normative consensus. Maybe the war brought about ripeness, but it's not clear. Maybe Iran might act as a factor to bring parties together. I think that among the 6 conditions, the only one that might bring some hope is the internationalization of the conflict and international mediation. The thing is that to a large extent, we are depending upon the whims of President Trump, right? The good news, I mean, when you look back and look at the plan of the Arab League, you know, to reconstruct Gaza after the war, which was in a sense a it was a response to this Trump suggestion about the Riviera. In a sense, you might say you have the regional context in place, okay? So there is a lot of change and continuity in IIER, international relations, the return of Palestinian issue to center stage, unintended consequences of the war, North-South relations. I mean, we can spend an entire seminar, an entire day talking about those different issues. In normative terms, not just realpolitik, I would say that to implement a model of peaceful territorial change, 2 things should happen, and I know I'm only expressing my own opinion. One is that I think that it makes a lot of sense, not just in moral terms, but in realpolitik terms. Israel should be the country to recognize a Palestinian state on the conditional terms. For instance, demilitarized, Palestinians cannot have a state that also asks for a right of return, because that would be asking for a state and a half. Okay? And the second point, which I got interested before the war, and I think that in long term, that's the only possible solution. And I was learning at the Acropolis Museum and the Archaeology Museum, actually you invented that, which is the idea of a confederation. Confederation, it's like the EU to some extent. It's not a federation. But I think that since there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians between the river and the sea, and they're pretty much intermingled, that's the model, okay? So people say I'm trying to be optimistic. I think I'm not too naive. I think hope should be stronger than fear. I still have to learn how many Israelis came to the streets today to oppose what the government is trying to do, and maybe the internationalization of the conflict might be a positive thing. Okay, I think I would stop here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and I want to thank you, all of you, and
Very much for this very
we can open. The thing is that it's Dimitri.
yes.
Is there a wire microphone, or I should get? I mean, I have my hearing devices, but okay, great.
There is a mic.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kacowicz. Kacowicz, for this very comprehensive and articulated lecture. It raised a lot of questions, at least for me, I think also for the audience. Having done all this dividing actually in three parts, the international dimension, the regional dimension, and you didn't say some things about the domestic situation, which I think when I say domestic, I don't only referring to Israel, of course, but also to the Palestinians, because they have also their own domestic problems, and we know what happened after the elections of the Palestinian state in Gaza and also in the autonomy region. So there is also the domestic level of analysis, which play a leading role, because we're talking about not only about the political system, but we're talking about leadership as well. And for example, Netanyahu, we know that he's playing games also for his domestic purposes because he's under investigation. And he tries to avoid what is accused of. I'll say to you that in 1999, I was in Israel and in West Bank with an assignment from the Council of Ministers, Moratinos, trying to find out, because it was during Barak government, the prospects of a peace. And the European Union, especially the Councils of Ministers, wanted to know how many Palestinians are able to come back in a future Palestinian state, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Jordan. And what I found out, and I think I realized the situation because we made an interviews with people in Palestine and also people from Israel, that there was a tendency at that time. And when I came back, I found it also that many Israelis, which were at that time in favor of a peace deal, they wanted a separation. Even from the Labour Party people wanted to build up the wall, to separate the two peoples. And this tendency, I think, continued. Under these circumstances, and I'm sure also from the Palestinian side, there was the same tendency. In other words, of not being in a confederate state or in a dual state, like the Hungarian-Austrian Empire. The narrative which started to build up at that time was separation.
Yes.
And that means that we don't want to live together. If this is the case, one conclusion is that perhaps there is an open opportunity for a two-state solution. But this means that Israelis are, and the Israel government is ready to accept two-state solution, which means the recognition of a future Palestinian state, which it is not. I'm more pessimistic about you. And I think that in Israeli society, there is a change, a rapid change. Do you remember hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating in Tel Aviv about peace at that time? But perhaps due to that the Palestinians had not a clear-cut policy. Perhaps because of Hamas, which it is, and it is considered as a terrorist organization, but despite these facts, it was controlling the Gaza Strait.
Yes.
It is like a government, de facto, but it is. And the Palestinian people are in favor of that, even in Gaza. I think that the two people are moving apart, and the solution of a confederation state is, it seems to me at least, not a rather pragmatic solution. Meanwhile, two-state solution perhaps is more pragmatic, subject that the Israeli will change its attitude and its policy. The second point, which you mentioned about the preconditions for a peaceful solution or conflict resolution, is that there are also the objective conditions, third-party intervention, so on and so forth. But also from a constructivist point of view, history plays a very important role, and the narratives. And only a strong leadership could change the attitude of the people. I think, now adopting foreign policy analysis, leadership, especially in this part of the world, is very important. So unless we have not a change in the attitudes, and unless we cannot have a very strong leadership like Rabin or like Sadat, because Sadat wanted peace, even before the Yom Kippur War, even before the Yom Kippur wanted peace. And perhaps he started the war in order to achieve peace. I think that there are no possibilities for a conflict resolution, and I have no answer what it's going to be. For example, take Gaza. We have these Trump propositions for changing Gaza, which is implying the deportation of 2,300,000 people from Strait of Gaza, I don't know where, to Somalia, to other things, and how this could be achieved. And I finish with Moshe Yaalon, the former defense minister of the Netanyahu government. He has recently pointed out, not now, but also the previous weeks, and especially now after Israel started again the bombardment, and it was Israel which violated the truce, that what we're going to do, ethnic cleansing, how this is going to happen. But perhaps we had in the past ethnic cleansing like the Armenians by Turkey, or we have exchange of populations. So I'm a little bit pessimistic. If the Israeli leadership, the current leadership, perhaps there will be a change and the opposition could win the elections. But I'm much more concerned about the narratives which prevail in the Israeli society. That most of them, they want separation from the Palestinians with every cost, with the wall, with whatever. I'm stopped here. Okay. Just for the sake of the argument, if one would like to respond, and then to open the discussion.
Let me take a minute. I mean, we can continue for hours, but just to open, because you brought very important points. One has to do the emphasis upon domestic politics on all parties, leaders. You're right that the tendency has been always for separation. Now, if I use my Latin American roots of telenovela, you might say separation, it's a divorce. I mean, the late Rabin used to say, we are here, they are there. The contrary case would be a marriage that might end in a catastrophe, like the War of the Roses, if we are familiar with the movie. You know, the spouse is killing each other. So that's why the idea of confederation that I'm aware, that sounds like science fiction, it's a kind of cohabitation. I mean, it's a kind of somehow in the middle. But I'm aware, by the way, that's not contradict the two-state solution. Just very quickly, because that might be interesting for you and the audience, I'm aware that right now there are about 20-25% of the Israelis like me that they are in favor of state solution.
Minority, yeah.
About that. But, and that's a very important but, and people are not aware, when you look at the public opinion polls consistently, and you know, here I'm stereotypical of my own country, Israelis, we like packages. We come here to Athens, you know, in packages that they are very attractive. So when you put a package that includes peace with Saudi Arabia, normalization, that's the way it's called today, an alliance against Iran, that can rise all the way to 55-60%. Now, using the term Palestinian state does not look very, you know, cozy or very politically correct. Now, another point which is very important, and I share your concern, has to do with ontological security. I mean, in constructivist pharmacological language, we refer the sense of the lack of physical security. Not physical, no, but also, it's not just physical security, it's more than that. It's about your soul. I mean, whether you feel secure regarding your existence, your raison d'etre. And you're right that you need a new leadership. And I'm very concerned that the next messiah, in Israeli politics is the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. And he's very, very hawkish. I mean, he sounds more normal, you might say, than the current Prime Minister, and he used to work for the state rather than the other way around. But when I had this conversation with Bill Zartman, he said, Arie, what you have here, it's like Algeria and France. So what's the solution? I told him, the goal. You needed the goal. We don't have it, the goal. Okay? So in that sense, there is a significant problem in terms of leadership. Okay. So we can open right now.
Yes.
Q&As.
Yeah.
Just tell me who you are, or you run this.
Yeah. Please. Professor Kefala first, then the lady.
With the mic, if.
Identify yourself.
I am Professor Vidi Kefala, and my domain is Middle East and North Africa, international relations in the broader Middle East and North Africa. I'm studying the Palestinian question for decades now. And I'd like first to congratulate you for your lecture. It was really comprehensive and very interesting. And really, we could talk for days, not for hours. Well, I will restrain myself to a remark and the question. The remark is that, in my opinion, the Palestinian question is an international one because it's about the right of self-determination of a people. In that respect, this is an international question and not a bilateral one. And the question is the following. Why, in your opinion, the internal political life in Israel has changed so much? Where is the left? Why the ultra-Orthodox parties gain so much support? Why Jerusalem Times, I think, wrote that it is the most ultra-conservative government in Israel ever? Why this change? Thank you.
Should we accumulate, right?
We'll collect another question, then you could answer. Please, the lady, identify yourself, please.
Hello, thank you for your...
Who are you?
Yeah, my name is Eleni.
Eleni?
Anesiadou. I'm a journalist in international relations. I'm really focused on this area. And now I'm trainee as press officer in the European Parliament here in Athens, in Eplo. Thank you very much for this inviting speech. I would like to ask you that, first and foremost, my first question is, how does global public opinion shape the policies of Israel and Palestine? And the second one is basically that we all know that apart from Israel and Palestine, there are so many other actors involved in this conflict, such as Hezbollah, Houthi, Iran. So I would like to ask, how does this conflict impact the balance of power in the wider region of Middle East? Thank you.
You could answer now, and then we should
Okay.
go to a second round.
Okay. So thank you very much. I mean, regarding your remark, I completely agree that you have you refer to the fact that the Palestinian issue, it's an international one. It has to do with right of self-determination. And in a sense, that's a truism. I mean, you might say, if we go back, when I was talking about confederation, I was suggesting, and people are not aware, going back to the partition plan of the UN, Resolution 181, refers to this, to the, you know, the equation. John Kerry was very smart in his final speech as Secretary of State, going back to that formula, 2 states for 2 peoples, which means the right of self-determination for 2 peoples. The Jewish people got the right, that's the state of Israel. The Palestinian people did not get de facto a Palestinian state. And I think that part of the idea that it's an international issue, it's because, in a sense, and that explains the very crazy relations between Israel and the UN. Israel is the child of the UN, when you think of it. Now, the second question, we can talk for hours. I mean, it's more of a political, sociological question. What happened to the Israeli political scene? Now, I think we have to disaggregate. I mean, the ultra-Orthodox parties, the religious ones, they are concerned with their sectorial demands. They don't want to serve in the army, and now the Israeli army has obviously a crisis because this has been a 7 multi-frontal war, right? And you have a community of more than 1 million people and hundreds of thousands of youngsters that don't serve in the army. So you should have to differentiate that from some that they call themselves like a national religious Zionism, that in my sense, it's an aberration. They are not Zionists. I mean, but they have adopted a very fundamentalist position. And part of the problem has to do with the Israeli politics and the fact, I would say, in the last 10 years, and I think you mentioned that the Israeli Prime Minister, I think he's an astute politician, but I think he's a lousy statesman, that to keep the coalition going, in a sense, he enabled, for instance, the fact, and this is, by the way, I have news for you, the return to the war has to do mostly with domestic politics. Has to do with the return of this ultra-right, nativist Ben-Gvir, that he's becoming again the Minister of Police, because Netanyahu needs him, the votes, to pass the budget. Okay? That's the real reason. So what I'm saying, and that's part of the tragedy, there are 2 parties in the Israeli coalition. Now the second party is joining again the coalition, that they were banned 10 or 20 years ago. A party like that, the Kahana party, was banned, right? Now I want to make the argument, maybe I'm wrong, they don't necessarily represent the majority of the Israeli public opinion. You have a silent majority that are completely confused. And in my sense, the way to understand politics, that you were right, it goes both for Israelis and Palestinians. Forget about right and left. By the way, there in the Middle East, we refer to right and left not like the French or normal people. It's your position regarding the conflict, because right and left, it's in economic terms. It's either, I would say, pragmatic, normal people, and the crazy ones that they want the land on religious terms. But that's the same. I mean, Eretz Israel, it's like the Hamas position regarding that the land is what? That it's sacred only for Muslims. And that's the problem. And I can tell you, I had a professor many years ago, Yoshafat Arkabi, that used to say, if this conflict is going to turn from a secular nationalist one into a religious one, about, whose God is strongest, then we are doomed.
This is yes, a matter of identity.
Yes. So it's not right and left, it's either pragmatic versus fundamentalist. Now, Eleni, how does the global public opinion see Israel-Palestine? Well, I guess here in Europe, you know, or when you look at the BBC or the CNN, I mean, I think that there are biases. Sometimes there is a lot of ignorance. I can tell you, it's interesting, you know, back at home, it's not that there is censorship. Still, we have a free press in Israel, but you don't see much of the global public opinion, or there is a tendency to refer to that, oh, they are automatically anti-Semitic. So our role is to explain life is much more complicated. But I can tell you, part of the problem, this conflict, is the level of ignorance. I have a colleague at Berkeley who ran for 500 US students a poll asking them, Palestine should be free from the river to the sea. Tell us which river, which sea. And we can laugh together because they came to the Caspian, to the Nilus, to the Euphrates. You know, there is a lot of ignorance. Why? Because it's complicated. Now, the second question you ask is a much more pointed one. You know, I can quote, that's what we do in academia, we quote colleagues. Eli Podeh, you might know the name, you know, who's an historian, expert in Middle East like you are, he was making the case that when you look at the regional context, it's plus la même chose. I mean, it's not that you have a tremendous change in the balance of power. There might be one element which might also be a positive one, unlike in Israel, and that's, I think, another Greek term about hubris or ibris. Ibris, you say?
Ibris is hybris.
Ibris, from IIER, right? I mean, is that we might think that now Israel is in its unipolar moment in the Middle East, which is rubbish. Because you might say that one unintended consequence of the war has been the weakening of the axis led by Iran. Now, if this can be, in a sense, you know, orchestrated into a positive direction, that might be a very good positive news. So the argument I'm making, and in a sense you can derive from that I'm not buying what the Prime Minister was saying yesterday on TV, you know, is that the strategic position of Israel 1.5 years after the war has improved. That does not mean that you have a tremendous change in the balance of power, but they have been very important events. I mean, the fact that the Assad regime completely poof, you know, and the fact that when you look at the Lebanese scene, that I think also gives hope in the sense that Lebanon might return to be more of a functioning country, right? So those are, I don't know, maybe you know more about that. Maybe it's wishful thinking, you know. But in general terms, I'm not seeing this tremendous change that the war has affected the balance of power. Not at the regional level, not even at the systemic level, of course.
Other questions, please? Yes, the gentleman there, in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Pedro Soldatos.
Soldatos.
Petros. Soldatos. Pedro, of course.
Pedro.
Oui.
First name, you know, we are.
I'm a graduate from the Department of Mediterranean Studies, degree in International Relations. I have the honor to have both Ms. Kefala and Ms. Tsardanis as professors in the university. We have some, I would say, specialization in the Middle East area and southeastern Mediterranean area. And I would like to go back a little bit to the early days of the conflict on the 7th of October 2023. For me, it's a little bit unclear why Hamas acted this way. And I would like to set a rather poetic word, let's say, the picture, the image. Until then, maybe after the last Arab-Israel wars, the image to the public and to the international community was that Palestinians were, maybe I will use some excessive words, were hunted down, get settlements to the West Bank and everything being surrounded with walls.
Yes.
Israel control the electricity and everything. So, and I can understand, and we've learned why many Palestinians turned to Hamas when they saw that the policies or the rhetoric of Fatah was incompetent to not maybe to resolve, but they saw also that the Palestinian matter to the international community were fading away. So, why Hamas acted like this way? Why they upload or publicize those images? The images of them hunting down Israelis, of killing them or shooting them or torturing them or everything. Okay. Yeah. And why Israel acted like this way? Because why didn't it use the image of the victim? At first, maybe yes. But after a while, we've seen that tables have turned. Why Israel did not...
so many whys.
Yeah,
okay.
there were very many whys.
I think it's rather stop here.
Yeah.
To give the chance to answer. Another question,
maybe
please.
Another question?
Yes, please. The lady there.
Hello.
All right. Hello.
Your name, please.
My name is Adamantia Katsaru. I'm a student.
Damandir?
Adamandium.
Adamandir.
Dying.
Okay.
You can call me Ada as well. I'm a student from the Department of Political Science and International Relations of the University of Peloponnese. And my question is, in this conflict, we have seen many violations of the international law in many aspects, like stopping the international help, killing innocents, and this hasn't had a lot of consequences. The war is still continuing. Everyone is doing their part without taking into consideration the international law. And my question is a little bit generic as for conflicts in general. And I'd like to ask how this is going to affect future conflicts. The fact that we have seen so many violations and nothing happened. Will future conflicts and future status quo take into consideration the international law after all this?
That's a paradigm.
Okay. No, those are very good. The good questions come at the end.
Yeah. As always.
Yes.
Is any other question or intervention? See? No, there is no. Yes. Would you prefer to collect the collection?
Yes,
or
yes.
Answer because it is 20.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Hello,
Please.
sir. Welcome to Greece, and thank you for your speech.
And you
is it
are?
open? Yeah, and I am Nikas Zanzidis. I am
Nikos Kazatsidis.
Nikolaos, whatever you wish.
And you are dressed much
I'm
better
a
than
PhD
me.
candidate at the Department of Mediterranean Studies. You said that the the implications of the war were not so significant either at a regional or systemic level, but we can see that I believe that the foreign policy of Israel is a realist one, a realpolitik, and at the moment, although it's fighting on many fronts.
Is it? There's a question for me.
Okay.
From
My
point
opinion.
of view, yes.
Okay.
From your point of view.
Although it's fighting on many fronts, it's winning on every theater of operations, and it's standing from a realist opposition. Like, I believe still that that Israel values military victories, is a militarized nation, and sees hard power as a means to end the conflict. So at the moment, it's closer than it has ever been to this goal. All its enemies are weakened, and I think that would be all. Thank you.
Okay.
May I complete this question with another one, which is relative? Despite the fact that Israel has the military might and is asymmetrical, even to Hamas and Hezbollah, especially to Hamas, after from October 2023.
Yes,
and
year
now
and
we
a half
have
almost.
March. They have not declared victory.
Right.
Even Israel, in such a small piece of land, they are not able to exterminate even Hamas,
Yes.
despite the bombardment. So
He's answering you.
yeah, exactly.
There is a puzzle here.
Yeah, there is.
Okay.
I think military might is not the only one means to declare yourself victor.
Yes. Okay. So let me take those four very quickly. Petro, and those are very good questions. I mean, we can spend lots of time. Officially, and that's interesting. I mean, you should, because you have to read the documents. Hamas came in January 2024 with a document in English, which is quite extraordinary, called Our Narrative Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. So you can Google that. So they are trying to explain, of course, they distort reality. They say they did not commit any massacre, it was a military operation. So there may be several answers to that question. One might have to do that Sinwar, the late leader of Hamas, misread, like Nasrallah. I mean, he expected that this would become a general war and, Palestinians within Israel, there are 2 million that they are citizens. And Palestinians in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, everybody will join. That did not happen. Maybe they wanted to stop the normalization with Saudi Arabia. Maybe there was a reaction to the incompetence with the PA. Why Israel reacted that way, I can tell you at home. Officially, in one day, you have almost 1,200 people killed, 250 people kidnapped. This was the worst catastrophe since the Holocaust. So the metaphor was the metaphor of the Holocaust. And that explains the harsh reaction and what became from a war of self-defense, you might say a war of revenge. And many Israelis, that's not my case, but there are many Israelis who would say, all the Palestinians are like Hamas. They want to throw us into the sea. Yes, that's easier. There has been a mutual violation of international law. And this was almost an impossible situation. And I'm not here, I don't work for the Israeli Foreign Ministry, thank God. I work for IIER. But one thing you have to be aware, in the Gaza Strip, half of the population, they are under the age of 18. And in a sense, Hamas has said that. The more civilian victims, the better for them. Now, that it's not a justification for the violation. There have been very serious violations of humanitarian law, crimes of war, etc. That does not mean that you have a clear case of genocide. But that's a problem in terms of impunity. And I don't like the comparisons people say, Russia did in Ukraine what Israel did in Gaza. But I'm aware of what you are saying because that's a serious problem in terms of international law. Still, again, it's a very complicated case. Even now that Israel has returned to the war for political reasons, they are issuing now, they are warning the population, you should move from the border. It's a very small area, otherwise you would be harmed, right? But that's a fact. That's a fact that has been a mutual violation of international law. I also suggest to you and everybody read the ICC warrants. It's very interesting what you have there, what you don't have there, what they are blaming Hamas, what they are blaming Israel. Now, Nico, I agree part of what you say, and I completely disagree as well. It's clear that Israel's foreign policy since 1948 has been realpolitik. The problem with Israel's foreign policy is that, first, it's a function of the security situation. so diplomats don't have much of a say, and it's reactive, okay? The problem here, you might say, well, Israel might be winning in military terms. But I can tell you what's the catastrophe here, is that the Israeli government for the last year and a half has never had a clear vision, okay, and I agree with my government, Hamas should not stay in power in the Gaza Strip. So if not Hamas, who should come instead of Hamas? The Egyptian plan, the Arab peace, the Arab League plan is not perfect, and they are referring to the PA. But for the government, for this government, which, as you say, it's the most ultra-right government, it's a catastrophe. For them, the PA and Hamas is the same thing. So in a sense, what you see here, I'm not politically correct, I'm aware, you see the same pattern of antagonistic cooperation that you had before the war, that Netanyahu prefers Hamas rather than the PA. For me, that's a complete failure. And that brings me to your last point, which again, that's the problem. I always complain at home, they don't invite me to TV, I'm a peace scholar. They bring all these security people. Because the problem is that the only way, and here I'm quoting Audrey Cronin, who's a US expert on anti-terrorism, she looked for 100 cases, and the conclusion is that the only way that Israel can defeat Hamas is by political means, by offering the Palestinians in Gaza, and you're right, it's related to the West Bank, because officially Gaza and the West Bank are part of the same territory. I mean, that was recognized by Israel by signing the Declaration of Principles, by offering a political alternative. And that's part of the tragedy. That's a tragedy in the sense it's not enough that you get rid of Hamas, because Hamas cannot be an interlocutor. But then you have to find a better political alternative.
Do you remember Hans Morgenthau?
What?
Hans
Morgenthau, yes.
What he was saying, the realists, about Vietnam War.
That was a catastrophe.
Exactly.
Now, by the way, if I can add, I'm abusing my time, and in a sense, I'm summarizing. The idea of peaceful change comes from another very important scholar of international relations, British one, Edward H. Carr, who wrote a book, The 20 Years Crisis.
Realist.
Now, to have a model of peaceful change, you have to find a balance between power and morality. Because, and back at home I have this argument, because Israelis, they don't differentiate between force and power. And I always tell them it's not the same word. Power and morality, you have to find a balance. Now, it's very tricky, because I would end, with a kind of a anecdote, academic anecdote. For those of you who might know about that book, in the book that we know after World War II, he condemns the Munich Agreement. You are familiar, the appeasement, who was the mediator in that agreement? Mussolini. That's a joke. But what is interesting, when I was a student at Princeton many years ago, this is 35 years ago, I found the original edition. The original edition of that book was published after the Munich Agreement, before Hitler violated. And in that original version, he celebrates Munich as an example of peaceful change. That's interesting, right? But I think you quote, by the way, Morgenthau, that people think is the ultimate realpolitik, he also talked about, he was an international lawyer. That's for you, Ada. An international lawyer. He always thought that the only way to survive is to find a balance between power and morality.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I enjoy your lecture, and I think everybody here, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation and delivering such
pleasure being here in Athens.
a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Okay.